I want you to think back to a specific moment. Perhaps it was the morning you stepped out of the shower, caught a glimpse of yourself in the bathroom mirror, and noticed for the first time that something had fundamentally shifted in the architecture of your midsection, not gradually, not incrementally, but as if somewhere between your 53rd and 57th birthday, your body had made a unilateral decision, without your consent, and without any apparent correlation to anything you had changed in your diet or your lifestyle. Perhaps it was the moment you reached for a pair of trousers that fit you perfectly 18 months ago and found that the waistband no longer closed comfortably. Not because you had been eating differently, not because you had abandoned your exercise routine, but because something inside your body had quietly, systematically, and without any visible external cause, begun redistributing fat in a way that defied everything you thought you understood about weight management. Or perhaps you have simply noticed, with a combination of frustration and genuine confusion, that the strategies that worked reliably throughout your 40s no longer produce any meaningful result. You cut calories, the belly fat remains. You increase your exercise, the belly fat remains. You eliminate certain food groups, the belly fat remains. You do everything that every weight loss framework you have ever encountered has told you to do, and the belly fat not only remains, but in many cases, continues to grow. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you have begun to suspect that the problem is not your willpower. It is not your discipline. It is not some personal failing or lack of commitment. You are right. The problem is biology, specifically a cascade of hormonal, metabolic, neurological, and cellular changes that begin accelerating significantly around the age of 55, changes that fundamentally alter the way your body stores energy, responds to caloric restriction, distributes fat tissue, and regulates the precise biochemical environment of your abdominal region. And the most important thing I can tell you at the very beginning of this conversation is this. The belly fat that accumulates after 55 is not the same substance as the belly fat you may have carried in your 30s or 40s. It does not behave the same way. It does not respond to the same interventions. It is not located in the same anatomical compartment. And it does not carry the same health implications. It is a fundamentally different biological phenomenon, one that requires a fundamentally different understanding before it can be addressed effectively. Hello everyone, I am Dr. Core, and welcome back to Dr. Core Health. What we are going to cover today is one of the most complex, most misunderstood, and most consequential metabolic shifts that occurs in the human body after the age of 55. A shift whose primary visible manifestation is the accumulation of abdominal fat, but whose true significance extends far beyond aesthetics into the core architecture of cardiovascular health, insulin sensitivity, cognitive function, inflammatory biology, and longevity. This is a long conversation, because this topic deserves the complete picture, not the oversimplified sound bites that populate the wellness industry, and not the reductive advice to simply eat less and move more that has failed tens of millions of Americans over 55 for decades. If you are new to this channel, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and settle in, because what we cover today may be the most clinically comprehensive and practically useful health education you have received on this subject. The first and most foundational concept in this conversation is the distinction between the two fundamentally different types of fat tissue that exist in the human abdominal region, and why that distinction matters enormously for both health and treatment strategy. The fat that most people think of when they think of belly fat is subcutaneous fat, the fat that sits directly beneath the skin surface, that you can physically grasp between your fingers, that produces the soft, compressible layer of tissue visible on the outer surface of the abdomen. Subcutaneous fat is metabolically relatively inactive. It serves primarily as an insulating and energy storage tissue. It does not communicate aggressively with the hormonal and immune systems of the body. And while excessive accumulation of subcutaneous fat carries health implications, it is not the primary driver of the metabolic dysfunction and cardiovascular risk associated with abdominal obesity. The fat that matters most in the context of post-55 weight gain is visceral fat. the fat that accumulates not beneath the skin, but deep within the abdominal cavity itself, surrounding and infiltrating the liver, the pancreas, the intestines, the kidneys, and the mesenteric tissue that suspends the digestive organs. Visceral fat is not a passive energy storage tissue. It is a metabolically active endocrine organ. This is not a metaphor. Visceral fat tissue contains hundreds of thousands of cells, called adipocytes, that actively synthesize and secrete a complex array of hormones, cytokines, and inflammatory signaling molecules that circulate throughout the body and exert powerful effects on virtually every organ system. These secreted substances include adipokines such as leptin, resistin, and visfatin, hormones that regulate appetite, insulin sensitivity, and inflammatory tone. They include pro-inflammatory cytokines including interleukin-6, interleukin-1 beta, and tumor necrosis factor alpha-DAI, molecules that drive systemic low-grade inflammation throughout the body. And they include free fatty acids that are released directly into the portal circulation, the venous system that drains directly into the liver, flooding the liver with lipid substrates that promote insulin resistance, triglyceride synthesis, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is why visceral fat accumulation after 55 is not primarily a cosmetic concern. It is a systemic inflammatory and metabolic disturbance that simultaneously drives cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cognitive decline, certain cancers, and accelerated biological aging. And here is the clinical reality that most people are never told. You cannot accurately assess your visceral fat burden by looking in the mirror or stepping on a scale. Two individuals can have identical body weights, identical body mass indices, and dramatically different visceral fat accumulations. The individual with more visceral fat carries substantially higher cardiometabolic risk, regardless of what their scale or their BMI calculation suggests. The gold standard for measuring visceral fat is abdominal computed tomography or magnetic resonance imaging, neither of which is routinely performed for metabolic risk assessment in clinical practice. A practical clinical proxy is waist circumference. The American Heart Association defines elevated cardiometabolic risk as a waist circumference above 35 inches in women and above 40 inches in men, measured at the level of the navel, not the narrowest point of the waist. But even waist circumference has limitations, because it cannot distinguish between subcutaneous and visceral fat accumulation. What matters most for the purpose of this conversation is understanding why visceral fat specifically accumulates so aggressively after the age of 55. And the answer to that question begins with the most profound hormonal transformation that occurs in the aging human body. The human body after 55 is undergoing one of the most significant hormonal reorganizations of its entire lifespan. And this reorganization, occurring simultaneously across multiple endocrine systems, creates the precise internal biochemical environment in which visceral fat accumulation becomes not merely possible, but physiologically inevitable without specific targeted countermeasures. Let me walk through the 4 primary hormonal systems whose changes drive post-55 abdominal fat accumulation. Hormonal change. Number 1. The decline of sex hormones. In women, the transition through perimenopause and into postmenopause, which occurs on average between the ages of 45 and 55, involves a dramatic and permanent reduction in circulating estrogen and progesterone levels. Estrogen, throughout the reproductive years, plays a critical and underappreciated role in fat distribution. It actively directs the body to store fat preferentially in the hips, thighs, and buttocks, the gynoid or pear-shaped fat distribution pattern, while simultaneously suppressing the accumulation of visceral abdominal fat. Estrogen exerts this fat-directing effect through estrogen receptors expressed on adipocytes throughout the body. When estrogen binds to these receptors in subcutaneous fat depots of the lower body, it promotes fat storage in those locations. When estrogen binds to receptors in visceral fat depots of the abdomen, it suppresses fat storage and promotes fat mobilization. When estrogen levels decline permanently at menopause, this directional influence is lost. The body loses its hormonal instruction to store fat in the lower body and suppress it in the abdomen. And the natural metabolic default, which, in the absence of estrogen signaling, favors visceral abdominal deposition, takes over. The result is the dramatic shift from gynoid to android fat distribution, from pear-shaped to apple-shaped, that the majority of postmenopausal women observe with frustration and confusion. They have not changed what they eat. They have not reduced their activity. But their body has fundamentally reorganized where it stores the energy it receives, and it now stores it preferentially in the visceral abdominal compartment. In men, the relevant hormonal change is the gradual but relentless decline in circulating testosterone that begins around the age of 30 and accelerates significantly after 55, a condition clinicians call andropause or late-onset hypogonadism. Testosterone exerts powerful effects on body composition through multiple mechanisms. It promotes the differentiation of mesenchymal stem cells, the precursor cells that can develop into either muscle or fat, into muscle cells rather than adipocytes. It stimulates protein synthesis and muscle fiber hypertrophy. It promotes fat oxidation, the metabolic burning of stored fat as fuel. And it suppresses the activity of lipoprotein lipase in visceral fat depots, the enzyme that promotes fat storage in those locations. As testosterone declines after 55, all of these effects are progressively attenuated. Mesenchymal stem cells increasingly differentiate into adipocytes rather than muscle cells. Muscle protein synthesis slows, fat oxidation decreases, and lipoprotein lipase activity in visceral fat depots is no longer suppressed, allowing fat storage in the abdominal visceral compartment to accelerate. The result in men is the progressive shift from a relatively lean, muscular body composition to an increasingly adipose one, with the fat accumulating preferentially in the abdominal visceral compartment where the testosterone suppressive effect on lipoprotein lipase has been lost. Hormonal change. Number 2. Cortisol dysregulation. Cortisol is the primary glucocorticoid hormone produced by the adrenal glands. It is commonly known as the stress hormone, but its physiological role extends far beyond the stress response to encompass glucose metabolism, immune regulation, inflammatory control, circadian rhythm maintenance, and critically, fat distribution. Cortisol exerts its fat-directing effects through glucocorticoid receptors expressed on adipocytes throughout the body, and visceral fat adipocytes express a significantly higher density of glucocorticoid receptors than subcutaneous fat adipocytes, meaning that visceral fat is disproportionately sensitive to cortisol signaling. When cortisol binds to glucocorticoid receptors on visceral adipocytes, it promotes fat storage, suppresses fat mobilization, and stimulates the differentiation of new adipocytes in visceral fat depots. It simultaneously stimulates appetite, particularly for high-calorie, high-carbohydrate, and high-fat foods, through its effects on the hypothalamus and the reward circuitry of the brain. After the age of 55, several age-related changes conspire to increase the effective cortisol exposure of visceral fat tissue. First, the diurnal rhythm of cortisol secretion, which in younger adults produces a sharp morning peak, followed by a steady decline throughout the day, becomes blunted and dysregulated with age. Evening cortisol levels, which should be at their daily nadir, remain inappropriately elevated in many older adults, a pattern called hypercortisolism of aging. Second, sleep quality deteriorates significantly after 55, and disrupted sleep is one of the most powerful activators of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, producing sustained elevations in cortisol throughout the following day. Third, the chronic low-grade psychological stressors of midlife and beyond, financial concerns, health worries, bereavement, caregiver burden, maintain a persistent low-level activation of the stress response system that contributes to chronically elevated cortisol exposure. The cumulative effect of this increased cortisol exposure on the glucocorticoid receptor-rich visceral fat depots is a powerful and direct stimulus for visceral fat accumulation, independent of caloric intake. Hormonal change. Number 3. Growth hormone and IGF-1 decline. Growth hormone, secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and its primary downstream mediator, insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1, produced primarily by the liver, exert powerful anti-adipogenic and anabolic effects throughout the body. Growth hormone promotes fat mobilization, the release of stored fatty acids from adipose tissue for use as metabolic fuel. It promotes lean muscle mass maintenance. It supports the structural integrity of bone, and it exerts direct suppressive effects on visceral fat accumulation. Growth hormone secretion declines dramatically with age. Total daily growth hormone secretion at age 60 is approximately 25 to 30% of the levels observed at age 25. This age-related decline in growth hormone and IGF-1 is now recognized as a significant contributor to the progressive body composition changes of aging, the loss of muscle mass, the increase in adipose tissue, and the preferential redistribution of that adipose tissue to the visceral abdominal compartment. Hormonal change. Number 4. Insulin resistance and the hyperinsulinemic state. Insulin resistance, the reduced sensitivity of cells throughout the body to the metabolic actions of insulin, is one of the most universal and most consequential metabolic changes associated with aging after 55. As muscle mass declines with age, a process called sarcopenia, the primary peripheral tissue responsible for insulin-stimulated glucose uptake, is progressively lost. The pancreatic beta cells compensate by secreting increasing amounts of insulin to achieve the same degree of glucose clearance from the bloodstream, a state called compensatory hyperinsulinemia. Chronically elevated insulin levels exert powerful fat-promoting effects. Insulin is the primary anti-lipolytic hormone in the body, meaning that elevated insulin levels actively suppress the mobilization of stored fat from adipose tissue. As long as insulin levels remain elevated, the biochemical environment of the body is fundamentally inhospitable to fat loss, regardless of caloric deficit. Furthermore, insulin resistance itself is not uniformly distributed across all fat depots. Visceral fat adipocytes become insulin-resistant earlier and more severely than subcutaneous fat adipocytes. This differential insulin resistance creates a situation in which visceral fat releases free fatty acids into the portal circulation at an accelerated rate, further driving hepatic insulin resistance, triglyceride synthesis, and the metabolic dysfunction cascade associated with visceral obesity. This is why caloric restriction alone, the foundation of virtually every conventional weight loss approach, is so spectacularly ineffective at addressing post-55 visceral fat accumulation. Caloric restriction reduces total energy intake, but it does not address the hyperinsulinemic state. It does not restore insulin sensitivity. It does not correct the hormonal reorganization that is directing fat storage to the visceral compartment. And in the context of chronically elevated insulin, the metabolic environment simply does not permit the efficient mobilization and oxidation of visceral fat stores, regardless of how aggressively calories are restricted. No discussion of post-55 belly fat accumulation is complete without a thorough examination of the relationship between muscle loss and visceral fat gain. Because these two processes are not independent phenomena occurring in parallel. They are deeply interconnected through shared hormonal, metabolic, and cellular mechanisms that make them mutually reinforcing in a way that creates a self-perpetuating cycle of body composition deterioration. Sarcopenia, the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass, strength, and function, begins in earnest around the age of 40 and accelerates significantly after 55. The average adult loses approximately 3 to 5% of their muscle mass per decade after 40, a rate that increases to 8% or more per decade after 60 in sedentary individuals. The metabolic consequences of this progressive muscle loss are profound and directly relevant to visceral fat accumulation. Skeletal muscle is the largest metabolically active tissue in the human body. At rest, muscle tissue accounts for approximately 30% of the body's total resting metabolic rate. The number of calories burned simply to maintain basic biological functions in the absence of any physical activity. As muscle mass declines, resting metabolic rate declines proportionally. An individual who loses 5 kilograms of muscle mass over a decade experiences a reduction in resting metabolic rate of approximately 250 calories per day, meaning that the same dietary intake that maintained a stable body weight at 50 now produces a consistent daily caloric surplus at 62, even without any change in eating behavior whatsoever. This is the metabolic arithmetic that explains what millions of Americans over 55 experience as the inexplicable onset of weight gain in the complete absence of any change in diet or lifestyle. They have not started eating more. Their body has simply become less metabolically efficient at burning what they eat, because the primary metabolic engine has been quietly downsizing for years. But the relationship between muscle loss and visceral fat accumulation extends beyond this simple metabolic rate calculation. Skeletal muscle is one of the primary sites of insulin-stimulated glucose disposal. When you consume carbohydrates and glucose enters the bloodstream, insulin signals muscle cells to take up and store that glucose as glycogen, the primary short-term energy storage form. Healthy muscle mass with good insulin sensitivity can rapidly clear glucose from the bloodstream following a meal, maintaining normal postprandial blood sugar levels and preventing the sustained insulin elevation that promotes fat storage. As muscle mass declines and insulin sensitivity deteriorates with age, this glucose disposal capacity is progressively lost. Postprandial glucose remains elevated longer. Insulin secretion must be sustained at higher levels to clear the same glucose load. And the chronically elevated insulin environment, as we discussed in the previous section, creates a biochemical state that is profoundly hostile to fat mobilization and profoundly permissive of fat storage. Furthermore, as muscle mass declines, the physical activity capacity that would normally contribute to energy expenditure and insulin sensitization also declines, not necessarily because of reduced motivation, but because reduced muscle mass directly limits functional capacity, produces fatigue more rapidly during physical activity, and reduces the mechanical efficiency of movement. The individual with significant sarcopenia is physically less capable of sustained activity, which further reduces energy expenditure, further impairs insulin sensitivity, and further accelerates visceral fat accumulation. This is the vicious cycle at the core of post-55 body composition deterioration. Muscle loss reduces metabolic rate and glucose disposal capacity. Reduced metabolic rate and glucose disposal capacity drive insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia. Hyperinsulinemia promotes fat storage and suppresses fat mobilization. Visceral fat accumulation promotes systemic inflammation. Systemic inflammation, particularly the elevated interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, secreted by visceral fat adipocytes, directly impairs muscle protein synthesis and accelerates muscle protein breakdown. Accelerated muscle loss further reduces metabolic rate, and the cycle perpetuates itself with increasing momentum through each successive year. Understanding this cycle is essential because it reveals why the interventions that successfully interrupt it must address muscle mass preservation and restoration, not simply caloric reduction. Two of the most powerful and most consistently underestimated drivers of visceral fat accumulation after 55 are sleep quality and chronic psychological stress, and their influence on abdominal fat deposition operates through direct, mechanistically understood hormonal and neurological pathways that are entirely independent of caloric intake. Sleep architecture changes dramatically after the age of 55. Total sleep time decreases. Sleep efficiency, the percentage of time in bed actually spent sleeping, deteriorates. The proportion of time spent in slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most physiologically restorative stage of non-REM sleep, declines significantly. And the prevalence of sleep disorders, including obstructive sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, and insomnia disorder, increases substantially. These sleep architecture changes have direct and measurable consequences for the hormonal systems that regulate fat storage and appetite. Growth hormone secretion is predominantly nocturnal. Approximately 70% of daily growth hormone release occurs during slow-wave sleep. As slow-wave sleep diminishes with age, growth hormone secretion diminishes proportionally. And as we discussed in the previous section, reduced growth hormone and IGF-1 directly promotes visceral fat accumulation. Ghrelin, the primary appetite-stimulating hormone produced by cells in the stomach lining, rises significantly with sleep deprivation. Leptin, the primary appetite-suppressing hormone produced by adipose tissue, falls with sleep deprivation. The combined effect of elevated ghrelin and reduced leptin is a dramatic increase in hunger, appetite, and specifically the craving for high-calorie, high-carbohydrate foods, the precise dietary pattern most conducive to visceral fat accumulation. Studies examining the relationship between sleep duration and visceral fat accumulation have consistently found that adults sleeping fewer than 6 hours per night accumulate visceral fat significantly faster than those sleeping 7 to 9 hours, independent of total caloric intake, dietary composition, and physical activity level. This is not a modest association. A landmark study published in the journal Sleep examined over 3,000 adults over a 5-year follow-up period and found that short sleepers gained nearly twice as much visceral fat as optimal sleepers, controlling for all other metabolic variables. Sleep deprivation also profoundly disrupts cortisol regulation. Even a single night of poor sleep produces measurable elevations in evening cortisol levels. The precise cortisol pattern that most aggressively promotes visceral fat accumulation through the glucocorticoid receptor-rich adipocytes of the abdominal visceral compartment. Obstructive sleep apnea deserves particular attention in this context. This condition, characterized by repetitive episodes of upper airway obstruction during sleep, producing oxygen desaturation, cortisol spikes, sympathetic nervous system activation, and sleep fragmentation, affects an estimated 30 to 40% of adults over 65 and is dramatically underdiagnosed in the senior population. Every episode of apnea, which can occur dozens to hundreds of times per night in untreated moderate to severe sleep apnea, activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, producing a cortisol pulse that further drives visceral fat deposition. Every episode produces sympathetic nervous system activation that promotes insulin resistance. And the cumulative sleep fragmentation eliminates the slow-wave sleep during which growth hormone would otherwise be released. The treatment of obstructive sleep apnea, most commonly with continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP, has been shown in multiple clinical trials to produce measurable reductions in visceral fat accumulation, improvements in insulin sensitivity, and reductions in inflammatory markers, without any change in diet or exercise. This is perhaps the most striking illustration of the principle that dominates this entire conversation. Belly fat after 55 is driven by biology, by hormonal and metabolic processes that operate entirely independently of caloric intake. And addressing those biological drivers produces meaningful results in ways that caloric restriction alone never can. Chronic psychological stress operates through overlapping mechanisms. The sustained activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis by chronic psychosocial stressors produces the same cortisol dysregulation, the same appetite stimulation, the same visceral fat-promoting effects as sleep deprivation. Stress-induced eating, the preferential consumption of high-calorie comfort foods in response to emotional distress, is driven not by a failure of willpower, but by the direct neurobiological effects of cortisol and other stress hormones on the reward circuitry of the brain and the hypothalamic appetite centers. Effective stress management, through whatever modalities are most accessible and sustainable for the individual, is not a peripheral lifestyle recommendation in the context of post-55 visceral fat management. It is a direct metabolic intervention with measurable effects on the hormonal environment that drives abdominal fat deposition. Stop for a second and actually look at what you've built your life around. Certainty, You want the guaranteed outcome before you take the leap. You want proof the relationship will work before you give it your full effort. You want confirmation the business will succeed before you commit real time and money. You want assurance before action, every single time. And you call this being careful, being responsible, being smart. It isn't any of those things. It's a request for something that does not exist anywhere in the actual fabric of reality. And you've been making that request your entire life without realizing it was structurally impossible to fulfill. The universe runs on probability, not certainty. That's not a philosophical position. It's the literal, experimentally confirmed behavior of matter at its foundation. And your life, your relationships, your career, your creative work, every decision you've ever agonized over is built from the same uncertain universe, governed by the same underlying principles. There is no separate set of rules for your life that suddenly grants the certainty the rest of physical reality doesn't have. You don't get a special exemption. Nobody does. So every excuse you've made for staying still, I'm just waiting until I'm sure, I need more information first, I'll commit once I know it'll work, is a request for something physics itself has already proven is unavailable. You're not being careful by waiting for it. You're operating on a flawed premise about how reality functions, and that flawed premise has a cost, paid in real time, real opportunities, and real years of your life that don't come back. Here's the part that should actually sting. This isn't an excuse you came up with through careful reasoning. It's a default. Brains are wired to avoid uncertainty because uncertainty, for most of human evolutionary history, correlated with danger. An unfamiliar plant might be poison. An unknown sound might be a predator. So your nervous system learned to treat uncertainty as a threat to be resolved before acting, not as the normal operating condition of reality to be navigated skillfully. That wiring made sense on the savannah. It makes considerably less sense when the threat is sending an email, starting a project, or having a difficult conversation. You are running ancient threat detection software in a modern context where the actual risk of acting under uncertainty is almost always smaller than the cost of permanent inaction. And you haven't updated the software. You've just kept obeying it, dressing the obedience up as patience, as prudence, as waiting for the right moment. When the right moment, defined as the moment all uncertainty disappears, mathematically cannot arrive. You've been waiting for a green light that the system was never built to give you. Think about specific decisions sitting in your life right now, unresolved, exactly where they were months or years ago. The career move you haven't made, the conversation you haven't had, the project you haven't started. Each one has been sitting in the same holding pattern, waiting for a certainty threshold that hasn't been met and isn't going to be met, because that threshold doesn't exist anywhere in the actual structure of how outcomes get determined. Not in physics, not in business, not in relationships, not anywhere. What you're actually waiting for, when you strip away the language of being careful, is permission to feel safe before you act. But safety, defined as the complete absence of risk or unknown variables, is not a real state available to you. It was never available to anyone making a meaningful decision about anything. Every person you admire for taking a bold action did not wait for that state to arrive. They acted while it was still absent because they understood, explicitly or instinctively, that it was never going to show up. This is not a call to be reckless. Reckless is acting without reading the probabilities at all. What's actually being asked of you is sharper than recklessness and more honest than your current paralysis. Read the probabilities as clearly as you can, accept that the picture will never be complete, and move based on the best information available rather than the perfect information that doesn't exist. That's not a lower standard than certainty. It's the only standard that was ever actually on offer, in physics or in your life. We have now established that visceral fat is a metabolically active endocrine organ that secretes inflammatory cytokines. But to fully understand the self-perpetuating nature of post-55 visceral fat accumulation, we need to examine in detail the inflammatory cycle that visceral fat creates, and why this cycle makes visceral fat uniquely resistant to conventional weight loss interventions. Visceral fat adipocytes secrete interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interleukin-1 beta into the portal circulation. These cytokines travel directly to the liver, the first organ to receive portal venous blood, and trigger a cascade of hepatic inflammatory responses that include increased production of C-reactive protein, increased very low-density lipoprotein synthesis, increased triglyceride output, and reduced production of anti-inflammatory adiponectin. The reduced adiponectin secretion is particularly significant. Adiponectin, produced by adipose tissue and circulating in inverse proportion to visceral fat mass, is one of the most powerful insulin-sensitizing molecules in the human body. It promotes glucose uptake in muscle cells, suppresses hepatic glucose production, and exerts direct anti-inflammatory effects on the vascular endothelium. As visceral fat accumulates, adiponectin levels fall, further worsening insulin resistance, further promoting hepatic triglyceride synthesis, and further reducing the anti-inflammatory protection of the vascular endothelium. The inflammatory cytokines secreted by visceral fat also enter the systemic circulation and reach the hypothalamus, so the primary brain center for appetite and energy balance regulation. Central hypothalamic inflammation is now recognized as a direct cause of leptin resistance, the condition in which the brain becomes unresponsive to leptin's appetite-suppressing signal despite adequate or elevated leptin levels. This is one of the most cruel and most underappreciated dimensions of visceral fat biology. Leptin resistance, driven by hypothalamic inflammation caused by the very visceral fat, whose appetite-stimulating effects the individual is struggling against, means that the normal feedback mechanism that should signal satiety and reduce appetite in the face of excess fat stores is functionally disabled. The brain cannot hear the leptin signal. Appetite is not suppressed. Hunger persists despite adequate or excessive energy stores, and the cycle of overeating, visceral fat accumulation, inflammatory cytokine secretion, and leptin resistance perpetuates itself with each passing year. The inflammatory cytokines from visceral fat also directly impair muscle protein synthesis, as mentioned in the muscle loss section, by activating the ubiquitin proteasome pathway, which degrades muscle proteins. This creates the direct mechanistic link between visceral fat inflammation and the acceleration of sarcopenia, completing the vicious cycle between muscle loss and visceral fat gain. And the vascular endothelium, the delicate inner lining of blood vessels that we discussed in earlier videos in the context of cardiovascular health, is directly damaged by the inflammatory cytokines circulating from visceral fat depots. The same endothelial dysfunction that impairs nitric oxide production, promotes arterial stiffness, and creates the substrate for atherosclerotic plaque formation is actively driven by the inflammatory output of visceral fat tissue. This is the mechanism through which visceral abdominal obesity is an independent cardiovascular risk factor, not merely a marker of unhealthy lifestyle, but an active biological driver of arterial disease through its direct inflammatory effects on the vascular endothelium. Armed with the mechanistic understanding we have built across the previous sections, we can now address directly and specifically why the conventional dietary approaches that dominate the weight loss industry are so consistently and so spectacularly ineffective at addressing visceral fat accumulation after 55. Conventional caloric restriction, reducing total food intake below maintenance caloric requirements to create an energy deficit, is the foundational principle of virtually every mainstream diet program. And in younger adults with normal hormonal function, adequate muscle mass, and healthy insulin sensitivity, caloric restriction does produce meaningful weight loss. But after 55, the hormonal and metabolic environment described in the preceding sections fundamentally alters the physiological response to caloric restriction in several critical ways. First, caloric restriction activates the stress response. When the body perceives reduced energy availability, as it does during caloric restriction, it activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and elevates cortisol. Elevated cortisol drives visceral fat storage. This means that aggressive caloric restriction, paradoxically, can actively promote the very visceral fat accumulation it is intended to address through its cortisol-elevating effects. Second, caloric restriction accelerates muscle loss. In the context of inadequate protein intake and negative energy balance, the body catabolizes muscle protein as an energy source, particularly in the absence of adequate resistance training stimulus. Each cycle of aggressive caloric restriction, followed by weight regain, the classic yo-yo dieting pattern, results in a net loss of muscle mass and a net gain of fat mass, progressively worsening the body composition profile with each cycle. Third, caloric restriction reduces metabolic rate. The body responds to sustained caloric deficit by downregulating thyroid hormone production, reducing sympathetic nervous system tone, and reducing the metabolic rate of individual cells, a phenomenon called metabolic adaptation or adaptive thermogenesis. The magnitude of this metabolic adaptation is substantially greater in older adults than in younger ones, and it persists long after the period of restriction ends, a phenomenon documented by the famous Minnesota starvation experiment and replicated in numerous subsequent studies. Fourth, caloric restriction does not address insulin resistance. The hyperinsulinemic state that suppresses fat mobilization in older adults is not corrected by eating less of the same dietary pattern. It requires a specific shift in dietary composition, particularly a reduction in the glycemic load and insulin-stimulating potential of the diet, to meaningfully improve insulin sensitivity and create the metabolic conditions in which visceral fat can actually be mobilized and burned. Fifth, caloric restriction does not address sleep quality, cortisol dysregulation, gut microbiome composition, or the inflammatory cytokine environment of visceral fat tissue. These biological drivers of visceral fat accumulation are completely unaffected by reducing caloric intake, which means that even a successful caloric deficit may produce minimal change in visceral fat specifically, while reducing more metabolically benign subcutaneous fat and lean muscle mass. The clinical evidence for this dietary pattern specificity in visceral fat reduction is now robust. Multiple randomized controlled trials have compared caloric restriction alone to specific dietary interventions targeting insulin sensitivity and inflammatory tone, including Mediterranean dietary patterns, time-restricted eating protocols, and low glycemic index dietary approaches, and consistently found that the dietary composition interventions produce significantly greater reductions in visceral fat specifically, despite similar or even smaller total caloric deficits. Having established what does not work and why, let us now examine in detail the specific interventions that the clinical evidence most strongly supports for reducing visceral fat accumulation after 55, organized by the biological mechanism through which each intervention operates. Intervention, Category 1. Resistance training for muscle preservation and restoration. Resistance training, also called strength training or weight training, is the single most evidence-supported intervention for counteracting the sarcopenia visceral fat accumulation cycle described earlier in this video. Resistance training preserves and rebuilds muscle mass, restoring the primary metabolic engine that determines resting energy expenditure and glucose disposal capacity. It directly improves insulin sensitivity in skeletal muscle, reducing the hyperinsulinemic state that suppresses visceral fat mobilization. It stimulates growth hormone secretion, both acutely during the training session and in the subsequent recovery period. And it promotes the secretion of myokines, signaling molecules released by contracting muscle cells that exert direct anti-inflammatory effects on visceral fat tissue and on the systemic inflammatory environment. The resistance training protocol most effectively supported by the evidence for body composition improvement in adults over 55 involves training 2 to 3 times per week, targeting all major muscle groups, using loads that produce muscular fatigue within 8 to 15 repetitions, and progressing the resistance load over time as strength improves. This does not require a gym membership or expensive equipment. Bodyweight exercises performed with proper technique and adequate intensity, squats, lunges, push-ups, rows using a resistance band, activate the same muscle mass, and produce the same metabolic and hormonal signals as machine-based gym training. The key variable is not the specific equipment. It is the intensity, the degree to which the working muscle is genuinely challenged during each set, and the progressive nature of the training stimulus over time. Intervention Category 2. Dietary Protein Optimization. Adequate dietary protein intake is not merely important for muscle preservation. It is a direct metabolic intervention that promotes visceral fat reduction through multiple mechanisms. Protein is the most thermogenic macronutrient, meaning that the body expends significantly more energy digesting and processing protein than it does processing equivalent caloric amounts of carbohydrate or fat. This thermic effect of food represents approximately 25 to 30% of protein calories consumed, compared to 6 to 8% for carbohydrates and 2 to 3% for fat. Protein produces the strongest and most sustained satiety signal of the three macronutrients, both through its effects on gastric emptying rate and through its stimulation of gut hormones, including glucagon-like peptide 1 and peptide YY that signal satiety to the hypothalamus. Protein stimulates muscle protein synthesis, the biological process of building and repairing muscle tissue, providing the raw material substrate that resistance training requires to rebuild lost muscle mass. And adequate protein intake in the context of modest caloric deficit helps preserve lean muscle mass during weight loss, ensuring that the tissue being mobilized from energy stores is primarily fat rather than metabolically valuable muscle. The protein requirement for adults over 55 aiming to preserve muscle mass and promote visceral fat reduction is substantially higher than the recommended dietary allowance, which was designed to prevent deficiency, not to optimize body composition in aging adults. The emerging consensus in geriatric nutrition science supports a protein intake of 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for older adults engaged in resistance training, representing a significant increase over the 0.8 grams per kilogram recommended dietary allowance. High-quality protein sources, animal proteins including eggs, lean poultry, fish, and dairy, as well as plant proteins including legumes, tofu, tempeh, and edamame when consumed in adequate total amounts, provide the complete array of essential amino acids required for muscle protein synthesis, with leucine being particularly important as the primary amino acid trigger for initiating the muscle protein synthesis cascade. Intervention Category 3. Carbohydrate Quality and Glycemic Management. Reducing the glycemic load and insulin-stimulating potential of the diet, without necessarily drastically reducing total carbohydrate intake, is one of the most evidence-supported dietary strategies for improving insulin sensitivity and creating the metabolic conditions in which visceral fat can be mobilized. This means prioritizing complex carbohydrates with high fiber content and low glycemic index, legumes, non-starchy vegetables, whole intact grains, and most fruits, over refined carbohydrates with high glycemic index and minimal fiber. White bread, white rice, refined breakfast cereals, sugar-sweetened beverages, and processed snack foods. The fiber content of complex carbohydrates serves multiple visceral fat-reducing functions simultaneously. It slows gastric emptying and glucose absorption, reducing the postprandial insulin spike. It serves as substrate for the beneficial gut bacteria that produce short-chain fatty acids. It increases satiety through its effects on gut hormone secretion, and it directly binds and removes bile acids from the digestive tract, reducing circulating cholesterol levels and promoting the hepatic conversion of cholesterol into new bile acids, which reduces hepatic lipid accumulation. Vinegar, specifically 1 to 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar or white vinegar, consumed with or immediately before a carbohydrate-containing meal, has been shown in multiple randomized controlled trials to meaningfully reduce postprandial blood glucose and insulin responses, improve insulin sensitivity over time, and in one landmark Japanese study conducted over 12 weeks, produce significant reductions in visceral fat area as measured by computed tomography, without any other dietary or lifestyle intervention. The mechanism involves the inhibition of alpha amylase, the digestive enzyme responsible for breaking down dietary starch into glucose, and the suppression of hepatic glucose production through acetic acid's effects on liver enzyme activity. Intervention Category 4. Sleep optimization. Given the direct and mechanistically understood relationship between sleep quality and visceral fat accumulation described earlier, sleep optimization is not a peripheral wellness recommendation in this context. It is a primary metabolic intervention. Establishing a consistent sleep and wake schedule, maintaining the same bedtimes and wake times 7 days a week, is the most powerful single behavioral intervention for improving sleep quality because it stabilizes the circadian regulation of cortisol, growth hormone, and appetite hormones. Maintaining a cool sleeping environment between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit promotes deeper sleep and the nocturnal growth hormone secretion that occurs predominantly during slow-wave sleep. Eliminating blue light exposure from screens in the 2 hours before bedtime, or using blue light blocking glasses if screen use is unavoidable, preserves the melatonin secretion that initiates the sleep transition and maintains slow-wave sleep architecture. And screening for obstructive sleep apnea, particularly in individuals who snore, who wake frequently during the night, who experience excessive daytime sleepiness, or whose bed partner has observed breathing pauses during sleep, is an intervention whose metabolic and cardiovascular benefits extend far beyond the improvement of sleep quality itself. Intervention Category 5. Stress reduction and cortisol management. Chronic psychological stress and the cortisol dysregulation it produces are direct biological drivers of visceral fat accumulation, and addressing them through specific, evidence-based behavioral interventions produces measurable metabolic benefits. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, a structured program combining meditation, body scan practices, and mindful movement, has been shown in randomized controlled trials to reduce salivary cortisol levels, reduce inflammatory markers, and produce significant reductions in perceived stress and anxiety in adults over $55, with documented downstream effects on abdominal fat distribution in several studies. Social connection and engagement. Maintaining active, meaningful relationships with family, friends, and community is one of the most powerful buffers against the chronic psychological stress that drives hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activation. The epidemiological evidence linking social isolation to accelerated metabolic aging and increased visceral fat accumulation is substantial and consistent. And regular moderate-intensity aerobic exercise, walking, swimming, cycling, exerts direct cortisol-reducing effects through its stimulation of endorphin release, its improvement of sleep quality, and its down-regulation of the stress response system through repeated exposure to the manageable physiological stress of exercise. The fundamental insight that this entire conversation has been building toward is this. Post-55 visceral fat accumulation is a multifactorial biological process driven by hormonal reorganization, muscle loss, sleep disruption, chronic stress, gut microbiome changes, and inflammatory cascades, operating simultaneously and interactively in ways that make any single variable intervention, any single diet, any single exercise program, any single supplement, fundamentally insufficient to address the complete biological picture. The approach that the evidence most strongly supports is an integrated one, simultaneously addressing multiple biological drivers rather than attempting to address one in isolation. This means building and preserving muscle mass through consistent resistance training, not as an aesthetic goal, but as a direct metabolic intervention that restores glucose disposal capacity, elevates resting metabolic rate, reduces insulin resistance, and suppresses visceral fat-promoting inflammatory signaling. It means optimizing dietary protein to support muscle protein synthesis, while shifting carbohydrate sources toward high-fiber, low-glycemic options that improve insulin sensitivity and support a diverse, anti-inflammatory gut microbiome. It means treating sleep as a primary health priority, not a luxury, and actively investigating and treating sleep disorders that are silently driving cortisol dysregulation, growth hormone suppression, and visceral fat accumulation every night. It means addressing chronic psychological stress as a metabolic variable, not a purely emotional concern, through whatever combination of mindfulness, social engagement, therapeutic support, and stress-reducing behavioral practices is most accessible and sustainable for the individual. And it means replacing the frustrating and counterproductive framework of willpower-based caloric restriction with a mechanistically informed strategy that targets the specific biological processes driving visceral fat accumulation in the aging body. The belly fat that has been accumulating in your midsection since your mid-50s is not a reflection of your discipline, your character, or your commitment to your health. It is the visible surface expression of a profound and complex biological reorganization, one that involves your hormones, your muscles, your sleep, your stress response, your gut microbiome, and the inflammatory architecture of your adipose tissue, unfolding according to a biological program that no amount of willpower, caloric restriction, or conventional dieting advice was ever designed to address. You deserved to understand this years ago. You deserved a complete explanation of the biology, not a dismissive recommendation to simply eat less and exercise more. And you deserved an intervention framework built on the actual mechanisms driving your specific metabolic challenge, not on the generic weight loss principles developed for a younger, hormonally different, metabolically distinct population. You have that understanding now. Use it to ask better questions of your physician. Use it to make more targeted choices about the interventions you invest your energy and your discipline in. Use it to replace the guilt and the frustration of conventional weight loss failure with the clarity and the agency of mechanistic understanding. Because the biology that has been working against you is not invincible. It is not inevitable. And it is not beyond the reach of the specific evidence-based, biologically informed strategies we have discussed today. Your body is not your enemy. It is a magnificently complex biological system responding rationally to a set of internal conditions. Change the conditions intelligently, systematically, and with patience, and the body will respond. I am Dr. Kaur. Thank you for investing this time in your health today. Subscribe to Dr. Kaur Health. Share this video with someone over 55 who has been told that their belly fat is simply their fault. And I will see you in the next one.